I recently passed my commercial multi-engine check ride. Woo, excited about that. But there are 5 things in particular that really surprised me about learning to fly twin-engine aircraft that I think if you know these ahead of time, it's really gonna help you in your training. It definitely would have for me. So a lot of the multi-engine training is handling the emergency of what happens when you actually lose one of your engines, when one engine fails. And so the first thing that surprised me is that when you lose an engine, it's actually harder than I anticipated to identify what just happened for the first few seconds. I really just thought that hey, if one of your engine quits, the prop will stop out there. Okay, we lost our left engine, let's go about it. But for the first few seconds, it's a little bit, I don't want to use the word chaotic, that's an overstatement, but it's harder to discern what just happened than I thought. Perfect example, on my check ride of all things, we're preparing for steep turns. So I'm doing my clearing turns, looking out the left window, clear left, yada, yada. As I'm doing that, the examiner slips his hand between our seats, I don't see him doing this, and flips off the fuel selector of one of our engines. And so I'm looking out this way, gearing up for steep turns and kind of running through my head and stuff. And all of a sudden, you know, the airplane just it just starts yawing and you can tell something is very wrong. Obviously we lost an engine, but for the first few seconds there, because you're focused on something else, in this case doing our left, I'm pointing left here, doing our left hand clearing turn, and all of a sudden you lost an engine, it takes a second to catch up with what is going on and then identify the bad engine. And they teach you how to identify and verify the engine that you lost, but it's not obvious because both of them are still spinning and both of your throttle quadrants are still, you know, they're set. It's not like they just pulled one of your throttles back. That's one of the ways they teach it. But another way they might teach it is just by failing your fuel. And so everything else in front of you indicates that both my engines should be going. And so it takes a second to figure it out, which leads me to point number 2. And that's that you really have to try to respond and not react when your engine fails. In most other maneuvers in training, you brief the maneuver before you do it. And there are not that many surprises. So you say, okay, I'm gonna do steep turns now, or now I'm gonna demonstrate a power off stall, etc. But in multi-engine training, once you've gone through an engine out a few times, they might fail your engine on you unexpectedly and for real. They might actually cut the fuel off. And it always took me about 10 to 20 seconds to just calm down and work the problem and not just react, because you're trying to catch up and all of a sudden your heart rate just spikes and you have to calm down and go through the checklist. And so if you're really low, they might not actually cut your engine for real, but they might pull the throttle back to simulate it. They might do that right after takeoff, which is a really bad time. I mean, it's no good time to lose your engine, but that's especially stressful because you're really thinking about a lot of other things. And now you have to switch gears and go back to the emergency flow and emergency checklist. And it's really easy to just let your heart rate spike and just start doing stuff. But it's really important to respond instead of react. It's a subtle nuance, but man, it's so important because part of the checklist flow is to identify and then verify the dead engine and then make a decision to fix it or feather it. And if you rush through that, you might accidentally identify the incorrect engine has failed and then you feather or secure the wrong engine and then both engines are dead. You got a whole nother mess on your hands. So this checklist flow is really, really important. And I had to work on it at home to try to calmly go through that memorized procedure to get some repetitions with it. And so one tip I have is to actually practice this in the car. So I would kind of try to surprise myself as I'm driving in the car and pretend I'm flying an airplane and say, hey, boom, you just lost an engine. And do it when you're not expecting it, or if you're like, man, I really don't want to walk through the engine outflow right now, just like do it. And whatever you can to kind of surprise yourself a little bit to try to build that muscle memory of, okay, take a breath, now respond, don't react. The third thing that surprised me is that the single engine instrument approach is not as chaotic as it sounds. So if you have an instrument rating and you're getting your multi-engine commercial add-on, that's a mouthful, you have to demonstrate an instrument approach while flying on one engine. Now, the thought of having to do that gave me kind of cold sweats leading up to it because there is a lot happening in that. There's a lot going on. You lost an engine, you have the hood on so you can't see outside the airplane, you have to fly an instrument approach, etc. But I was really pleasantly surprised to find out that yes, the first 10, 20 seconds, again, of responding and not reacting are kind of chaotic, or not chaotic, but they're challenging. Once you are stabilized on the approach and you're just flying it with one engine, it's actually pretty tranquil. I mean, you have to be a little bit more careful not to accidentally get low and not get slow as you would on any approach, but since you only have one engine and might not be able to climb out of it or speed back up, it's even more important than normal. But other than that, it's a pretty stabilized approach and it wasn't as challenging as I thought. So if you're intimidated by that particular part of the check ride, just be encouraged. I promise you can do it. The fourth thing that surprised me was that I did an accelerated program and it was a much taller task than I anticipated. It was supposed to be 2 full days of training and then the check ride on the 3rd day. But it ended up taking about 7 days because of weather delays, and honestly, I was really grateful for the extra couple of days. So I'd heard from a lot of people that they say, hey, the multi's easy, you can get it in a weekend, no big deal. And while that is kind of true because there's no written test, there's relatively little ground compared to your private or instrument or commercial and such to learn. It's really just about the flying and you don't have any minimum amount of hours in terms of your actual multi-training. to accomplish, but I did it in about 7 hours, and honestly 10 to 12, maybe 15 probably would have been too much, but 10 to 12 probably would have been a little bit more of a relaxed pace. I will say the benefit was that I kind of did in a buddy system, the flight school I was training at, and so we had 6 or 7 hours of training and then 6 or 7 hours of sitting in the back seat watching someone else do it. So you had a little bit more time to kind of shadow and get some mental reps than just those 7 hours I logged in the left seat. But the takeaway is this: I think if you're going to do an accelerator program, I think it's a great option, but I think you need to ask the question and be prepared to say, hey, what happens if I don't feel comfortable in these 6 or 8 hours? What's plan B? And don't be so committed to taking that check ride on day 3 or whenever it's going to be that it makes you feel really rushed in your training. I don't have any regrets about the way that I did it, but it was a taller task and a taller order than I thought. And the good thing, I think the only thing helping you in the multi of being able to do it quickly is there's not a whole lot of ground knowledge to learn. You have to learn kind of the basics of what happens when an engine fails, why is one engine possibly more critical than the other, and losing one versus the other, what happens to the airplane and why. But it's not that much, so it's pretty accomplishable. I was also surprised by how thankful I would be to have some familiar avionics on the airplane. Kind of going back to the previous point that it's difficult to build muscle memory that quickly when you only have 7 or 10 or even 15 hours in an airplane. You just don't have that much time to really feel like you're familiar in that cockpit. But having familiar avionics goes a long way. So the Seminole that I was training in had an Aspen and a Garmin 430. So kind of your primary avionics and your primary navigation system stuff, all that was super familiar to me. And I thought, yeah, that might help. Like, cool, that's convenient that I'm already familiar with those platforms. I didn't realize how convenient that would be, because you're having to learn so much of a new airplane, a new cockpit, panel layout. There's new systems, there's new emergencies, there's new engines on board. It's all new. And so if you can take one thing off of that list of new things that you're trying to adapt to and say, yeah, all this is new, but the avionics aren't new. Maybe I'm still training on a G1000 and I get to do a G1000 aircraft. Do something to just try to stack the chips a little bit more in your favor to where it's one less thing that's new on your plate that you're trying to figure out. So to the extent you can, I really recommend trying to find an airplane that has some level of familiarity with you, avionics being a big thing. And if you can't do that, it's not gonna make or break your training, but I promise you'll notice that it will help. Now, there was one other huge thing at the very beginning of all of my commercial training that I definitely did not expect, that I wish someone would have warned me about. And in the video on the screen, I'm gonna share with you what exactly that was and what you can do about it. So I'll see you over in that video.